Welcome everyone. As I promised, I'll keep it short. My name is Rishi Bhatnagar. I'm the head of architecture, banking technology within wealth management in Morgan Stanley. And what I'm going to be talking about is governance using architecture as code. So I'll go over a few things. First is when we talk about architecture governance, what is architecture? And then we'll talk about what is architecture governance. But architecture governance is really the practice of monitoring, and this is the definition from TOGAF, and each word really adds a lot of value. So it's the practice, which means that it is certain processes associated with it, it has roles, it has artifacts, all those different things that are associated with the practice. And then it is the practice of monitoring, which means there needs to be something that it has to be compared against, something that has to be monitored, and directing, which means that there is some consulting or some advising, some kind of that role involved in any architecture-related work. Of course, we're talking about software here, but same thing can happen to any architecture. The goal is to deliver, which means that we have to actually have some physical end product. It's not just theory. Desired outcomes. And in this case, I want to emphasize that the desired outcome is not the beautiful architecture, it is the business functionality that needs to be delivered. We always have to remember that our architecture practices, our delivery is subservient to what we want to deliver as a business. Even when we talk about tech companies, they're delivering their business value. Google is not building technology for the sake of technology. They are building because they want to give it to their business users, right? And we have to adhere to certain principles, standards, and roadmaps, which means we have to have those in place. We need to have certain principles, tech principles that we need to adhere to. We need to have certain standards that are defined, and we need to have the roadmaps that could be built on those. But the trick is that they have to be measurable. Just like we talk about goals, that they have to be SMART goals, we need to have our standards and principles that they need to be objective. It should not be that when we get in fresh in the office and we read a standard, we understand it differently than when we are tired and at the end of the day we read it differently. They need to be very objective, they need to be very measurable, and they need to be metric oriented. So I'm not going to go through in depth on what the processes are, but we essentially need to make sure that we are doing some reviews. We are understanding that if there is a gap between an architecture that we reviewed versus an architecture that we deployed, we should be able to understand that, right? So what we did, so this is, now we come to the second aspect, which is architecture as code. So now that we've defined something very objectively, what's the next thing we logically do? We write it as a code, right? We can talk about it as everything as code nowadays. Infrastructure as code, business as code, and everything is as code. So architecture as code, right? And it is a codified representation of the architecture, which is what I was talking about. It's well-defined, it's measurable, and diffable. So you can't, it's not very easy, leaving Gen I aside, it's not very easy to diff two diagrams and say what is the difference between the two. But if you have a codified representation of that diagram, you could say authentication changed or the protocol, transfer protocol changed. So those kind of things are diffable, and that allows us to have a very measurable way of saying the architecture is different. So this is a product that we just recently got patent. So as you can see, the status there says it's patent pending. Since then, it has changed status. It is patented. So we have this system that we built, and some of my colleagues who've helped me are here as well. We've integrated this with several different firm systems, including our security architecture system. We are also leveraging a FINOS language that we actually are working with FINOS. It's called CALM, and you would actually have a session on that tomorrow. I think, Dennis, you're going to be talking about that. And we had another session earlier in the day. Aldwin and Eva, they talked about it, right? So thank you. So kudos to a lot of the teams. We have had that. And then also it's going to link to change management. So what Rita, Samir, and Menak and Jaya, they talked about earlier. When we talk about a change management, we need to understand that what architecture we approved, it has to compare with what is actually being released. So there are a lot of different aspects of architecture. So if you look at this, I'm going to talk about very briefly about the different modules within it. In the center sits Libby, which is our librarian. As you would notice, affectionately, we've anthropomorphized everything here, right? So we have Libby the librarian, which actually stores the relational database that has all the data and all the relationships between different containers and context and the systems and all the different runnable piece of code and so on. Then we have Archie, which is our authoring engine. And the authoring engine can either be form-based, where you are either manually adding systems or you're dragging and dropping, or it could be an AI connected where you can use prompt engineering to create something, or a wizard-based approach. Depends on your choice. Then we have RT, which actually converts the model that has been stored, the architecture model that has been stored, into diagrams. Now, the diagram follows an approach called C4. Some of you may be familiar with C4. It is the context, container, component, and code. It's essentially a 4 zoom level representation of architecture that standardizes. You go to a firm and say, what is your level 0 diagram, level 1 diagram, level 2, and there is no definition of what is a level 0 in one organization versus a level 0. So this is an industry specific way where the context diagrams usually lay down the context in which your system exists. What are the surrounding systems around it? What are the organizations that own it? What domain does it belong? And so on. So it places that system in the context. Then you have the containers that run within that context, which are all the runnable instances there, your databases, your services, your UIs, your APIs, all those different things. And then below that, you start getting into components, which are your libraries. Maybe there are some NuGet or jar files or some codes that you're using. They may not run independently, but they are isolated piece of logic. And then finally, we get into code, which we are not going to talk about. So that's really RT. It actually draws out the diagrams in a standard format. And the idea is that you can actually filter and zoom along all the different diagrams. So you can find out which systems are using a particular authentication, or when are they going to get decommissioned, or which one have a technical debt, and you can do all those kind of things. Merlin, which is our next module, this is the GenAI-based module. And this is the one that could actually go through your code source code and be able to import your architecture from there. Then we have Second Forest. The idea is that it would loop back from your production logs and your telemetry to identify if there are instances where if there is an increased traffic, your system behaves in unexpected ways. Maybe it starts getting high CPU usage, or it runs out of memory, and that should change your architecture. So there is feedback. Now, as you can see, it's not highlighted, which means we haven't started working on that yet. Then there is Easy, which is either your ticket generator or it is infrastructure as code. Again, we haven't started working on that, but that's the idea. And then we have the auditor, which is actually going to do compliance check. So it will say, this is what architecture was approved. You had a digital signature on the architecture. This is the manifest that was created at the time of approval. And then when you are releasing it in your change management ticket, you can compare the manifest and say, is this actually a significant departure from what was approved? And we can get signatures not just from the functional architecture, but also security architecture, infrastructure, application support group, and SRE, and so on. A lot of different approvals can go in. And then we have Babel on the top right, which allows us to talk to different firms. It's a universal translator. And then Fortress is the one that actually allows us to put our security blueprints, codified security blueprints. And that could validate not just security blueprints, but also are you following approved tech principles and all the different guidelines. So it can actually do that comparison. Right at the time of you designing the architecture, it will say how compliant you are. Somebody was talking about compliance, right? Kelsey was talking about compliance. This will give you compliance. So this is just a quick flow of how things would work. So a business owner would start working on creating a business architecture in Breeze. The application owner would create a mapping from the business architecture to the different technical systems that exist, and will create an architecture. At that point, a snapshot of that would be taken. And this is the version. Now, you can keep going, making changes, but that's the version that will be circulated to all the architects for approval. If you want to change the version, you can create a new version, send it out for approval, but that ensures that everyone is approving the same version. It's not that one team is approving version 1, something changed, the next team is approving version 2, and everybody is all over the place. Once the system is approved, the architecture is approved, audit tracking would capture each of the approvals. And when the team is coding, because we know where the code is being stored in the repository, we will monitor the code and it will start looking for architecture drift, right? And then when you submit the change management, this is what we talked about, it will validate the release. Now, there are a lot of different places where AI can start coming in. Some Gen AI, like for example, generating a narrative of what the release is going to be. So instead of somebody physically saying, here is the release notes, the release notes can be automatically generated from the architecture changes, right? Much more accurate, maybe even easy to read, right? Better than developers. Developers can write code, not documentation, right? Even also suggesting use cases to some of the business owners. Oh, I see that you're designing a debit card system. Have you thought about reordering? I know you put in a use case for ordering, but you didn't put in a use case for reordering. How about some missing use cases? So based on the industry experience, Gen AI can help with that. Then there are also summarization and other different AI models. We can auto-generate scaffolding. We can generate infrastructure as code. So there is a lot of potential that can be on an open and extensible framework that we are building in as Breeze. And at some point, we are focusing on releasing at least parts of it as open source. I think this is, yeah, this is it. So I know 522. Yeah, but hopefully, yeah, I read. Yeah, that's actually a good point, and this is something that we've started discussing. Actually, Aldwin is here, who's our from the information security side, right? And we've talked about that when we are exporting the model from functional architecture to the system that handles the security architecture, as a part of it, we can automatically generate tickets, right? Once the approval is done, we can automatically generate tickets. We can verify, we can capture evidences. We can even write scaffolding for some of the codes. And we can automatically argue whether certain cybersecurity principles were followed or not. But you're absolutely right, it can be done. Not only that, because this is built API first, other systems can query this also and make sure that they can get whatever reports they need to get. That's a very good question. So we debated on that a lot because one of the possible use cases is data lineage. So if we do start capturing the data contracts and the data, so we don't actually capture the data model, we capture the API contracts, right? But it doesn't take long for somebody to build a plugin, because this is extensible, to build a plugin that would actually track the data models also. We have a separate project that's building the data models, but it doesn't, it's not too far away to link the two.
Yes.
Not in this model, but when we are doing our data lineage project, there it is. So there is a difference between how two technical systems are talking, and they may be calling something as account, but that account could be account like a checking account versus a savings account. So they all have different, so business has a verbiage of their own. Technology team has a verbiage of their own. We are trying to reconcile, but that's not the scope of this project.
Yeah. My last question.
Sure.
Is this application available for the other banks to use?
So right now, no, but that's what our goal is, to get it to open source at some point.
Because we do not want to reinvent the wheel when you have done so much.
But what we have available as open source is what Dennis is going to talk tomorrow about is CALM, which is the language model, the common architecture language model that this is going to interface with. So it allows you to capture the relationships between different systems, capture some of the attributes of the system, and you can build on top of that. What we do plan to release possibly is the Libby, which is actually going to be the data store, obviously without the proprietary information.
Yeah. So the Libby will be available when?
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed, fingers crossed. I don't know yet.
But good one, Rishi.
Thank you. Okay.
Good one.
Okay. Hi.
Hi. What is the patentable part of this?
This whole system is patented as a single system, extensible framework.
How would I infringe it?
How do you infringe it? All right. Maybe a question for the bar. RT is the rendering, and Archie is the authoring engine, where you are actually putting the input. So Archie is input, RT is output. Good question. So RT uses GraphViz, And we are also working on some new JavaScript frameworks. So you can use Go.js, you can use Mermaid, you can do a couple of things. I hope so, yeah. You can also link it to tools of your choice because it's going to be, so even right now, the way Libby and RT interact are JSON format files. So you could plug in some other tool instead of RT, like an industry rendering tool, like maybe Structurizer or something like that. And you could render it using that. You'll just need a translator, that's all. That's the idea. Yeah, that's the idea, but I don't think that's immediate. But that is the idea, yes. Yes, exactly. Good question. So the auditor has actually two functions. One is the architecture drift. Or I should rather say the architecture drift is actually calculated for two reasons. One is to tell the change approver of what the differences are. The second is as you are coding, real time it is monitoring the code and checking for drifts. Because see, it's very feasible that, and all of us know this, that we approved an architecture for a release, and as the release gets closer, certain things get descoped, right? So it is possible that not everything gets released or some tactical solution comes in place. So there are going to be some approved drifts, right? Yes. So the different reason. So the operational logs are for understanding that could the architecture be improved because of some operational issues. So for example, when we found that yeah. So that's a good question. I think when we are talking about infrastructure as code, whatever we are deploying, there are two ways you can look at that. First is you can look at the deployment scripts, right? Second is that once the code has been deployed, then you look at instrumentation and telemetry of what has actually been what is actually running. So if you have something like AppDynamics or some other tool that is running, it can give you a lot more instrumentation on the services that are running and what authentication protocol they use. So there are several data points, right? So it's not that one data point is going to give us everything. So there is instrumentation, there is deployment script, there is coded GitHub source code, and they approved. So I think there are a lot of things that we'll have to experiment and do it. So we haven't started on that module yet, though. Excellent. Oh. Thank you so much.